Hey, what's up, everybody? It's your girl, BeeSparrow, BuzzzTweet Radio, in affiliation with the MCDE Radio Network, and I just had to hop on right quick. I came across this headline that I just cannot pass, and it read, Jeffrey Epstein hoped to seed human race with his DNA. Let me say that one more time. Jeffrey Epstein hoped to seed human race with his DNA. Now, the wealthy financier who is accused of sex trafficking, Jeffrey E. Epstein, or Epstein, or however way you want to pronounce it, had an unusual dream. He hoped to seed the human race with his DNA by impregnating women at his vast New Mexico ranch. Mr. Epstein, over the years, confided in scientists and others about his scheme, according to 4 people familiar with his thinking, although there's no evidence that it ever came to fruition. Mr. Epstein's vision reflected his long-standing fascination with what has become known as transhumanism, the science of improving the human population through technologies like genetic engineering and artificial intelligence. Critics have likened transhumanism to a modern-day version of eugenics, the discredited field of improving the human race through controlled breeding. Mr. Epstein, who was charged in July with the sexual trafficking of girls as young as 14, was a serial illusionist. He lied about the identities of his clients, his wealth, his financial prowess, his personal achievements. But he managed to use connections and charisma to cultivate valuable relationships with business and political leaders. Sound like to me they trying to distance themselves from him already. Interviews with more than a dozen of his acquaintances, as well as public documents, show that he used the same tactics to insinuate himself into the elite scientific community, thus allowing him to pursue his interest in eugenics and other fringe fields like cryonics. And y'all know I don't know what some of these things are, but I would definitely going to look them up. This man is insane in the membrane. Lawyers for Mr. Epstein, who has pleaded not guilty to sex trafficking charges, did not respond to requests for comment. By the way, I heard Lifetime was about to do a documentary on him, the same as they did R. Kelly. Let's see. Mr. Epstein attracted a glittering array of prominent scientists. They included the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Murray Gell-Mann, who discovered the quark, the theoretical physicist, and best-selling author Stephen Hawking, the paleontologist and evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould, where they get all these damn titles from, Oliver Sacks, the neurologist and best-selling author George M. Church, and molecular engineer who has worked to identify genes that could be altered to create superior humans, and the MIT theoretical physics Frank Wilczek's a Nobel laureate. Where do these people get these titles from? Nobel Peace Prize winning physics, theoretical physics, paleontologist and evolutionary biologist, neurologist, molecular engineer. It's too much. The lure of some of the sciences was Mr. Epstein's money, and that's the first thing that came to my mind when I read that paragraph up above. That's all they was looking at, them dollar signs. He dangled financing for their pet projects. Some of the scientists said that the prospect of financing blinded them to the seriousness of his sexual transgressions and even led them to give credence to some of Mr. Epstein's half-baked scientific musings. Let me take a drink of this Dr. Pepper. Oh my goodness. This is really... Lord have mercy. They really working on superhumans. They really working on superhumans, y'all. Y'all better open your eyes and realize. Scientists gathered at dinner parties at Mr. Epstein's Manhattan mansion, where Dom Perignon and expensive wines flowed freely, even though Mr. Epstein did not drink. He hosted buffet lunches at Harvard's programs for evolutionary dynamics, which he had helped start with a $6.5 million donation. Others flew to conferences sponsored by Mr. Epstein in the United States Virgin Islands and were feted on his private island there. Once, the scientists, including Mr. Hawkins, crowded on board a submarine that Mr. Epstein had chartered. See, where does he get all this money from? Oh, the Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker said he was invited by colleagues, including Mark Nowak, a Harvard professor of mathematics and biology, and the theoretical physics Lawrence Krauss, to salons and coffee, at which Mr. Epstein would hold court. While some of Mr. Pinker's peers hailed Mr. Epstein as brilliant, Mr. Pinker described him as an intellectual imposter. He would abruptly change the subject, ADD style, dismissing observation with an adolescent wisecrack, Mr. Pinker said, kind of like Donald Trump. Another scientist cultivated by Mr. Epstein, Jaron Lanier, a prolific author who is a founder of virtual reality, said that Mr. Epstein's ideas did not amount to science and that they did not lend themselves to rigorous proof. Ms. Lanier said Mr. Epstein had once hypothesized that atoms behaved like investors in a marketplace. Mr. Lanier said he had declined any funding from Mr. Epstein and that he had met with him only once after Mr. Epstein in 2008 pleaded guilty to charges of soliciting prostitution from a minor. Mr. Epstein was willing to finance research that others viewed as bizarre. He told one scientist that he was bankrolling efforts to identify a mysterious particle that might trigger the feeling that someone is watching you. At one session at Harvard, Mr. Epstein criticized efforts to reduce starvation and provide health care to the poor because doing so increased the risk of overpopulation, said Mr. Pinker, who was there. Mr. Pinker said he had rebutted the argument, citing research showing that high rates of infant mortality simply cause people to have more children. Mr. Epstein seemed annoyed, and a Harvard colleague later told Mr. Pinker, a Harvard colleague, I don't know how a Harvard college can tell him that, but a Harvard colleague told Mr. Pinker that he had been voted off the island and was no longer welcome to Mr. Epstein's gatherings. Then there was Mr. Epstein's interest in eugenics. On multiple occasions, starting in the early 2000s, Mr. Epstein told scientists and businessmen about his ambitions to use his New Mexico ranch as a base where women would be inseminated with his sperm and would give birth to his babies, according to 2 award-winning scientists and an advisor to large companies and wealthy individuals, all of whom Mr. Epstein told about it. I feel like I need to read that paragraph again. On multiple occasions, starting in as early as the 2000s, Mr. Epstein told scientists and businessmen about his ambitions to use his New Mexico ranch as a base where women would be inseminated with his sperm and would give birth to his babies, according to 2 award-winning scientists and an advisor to large companies and wealthy individuals, all of whom Mr. Epstein told about it. It was not a secret. The advisor, for example, said he was told about the plans not only by Mr. Epstein at a gathering at his Manhattan townhouse, but also by at least one prominent member of the business community. One of the scientists said Mr. Epstein divulged his idea in 2001 at a dinner at the same townhouse. The other recalled Mr. Epstein discussing it with him at a 2006 conference that he hosted in St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands. The idea struck all 3 as far-fetched and disturbing. There is no indication that it would have been against the law. Once at a dinner at Mr. Epstein's mansion on Manhattan's Upper East Side, Mr. Lanier said he talked to a scientist who told him that Mr. Epstein's goal was to have 20 women at a time impregnated at his 33,000 square foot Zorro Ranch in a tiny town outside of Santa Fe. Mr. Lanier said the scientist identified herself as working at NASA, but he did not remember her name. Woo! This man is off the chain. According to Mr. Lanier, the NASA scientist said Mr. Epstein had based his idea for a baby ranch on accounts of the repository for germinal choice, which was to be stocked with the sperm of Nobel laureates who wanted to strengthen the human gene pool. Laureates. I have to look up that word, and I'm about to do that right now. But, according to Mr. Lanier, the NASA scientist said Mr. Epstein had based his idea for a baby ranch on accounts of the repository for germinal choice, which was to be stocked with the sperm of Nobel laureates. Let me look that up right quick, because I have no idea. Who wanted to strengthen the human gene pool. What is a laureate? I wonder. And as soon as this page opens, I'm going to find out. Because that's what you do. If you don't understand something, you don't know something, you what? Look it up. Laureate. How you say it? Laureate. A person who is honored with an award for outstanding creative or intellectual achievements. Laureate. So going back to the discussion of laureates, according to Mrs. Lanier, The NASA scientist said Mr. Epstein had based its idea for a baby ranch on accounts of the repository for germinal choice, which was to be stocked with the sperm of Nobel laureates who wanted to strengthen the human gene pool, or the white human gene pool. Only one Nobel Prize winner has acknowledged contributing sperm to it. The repository discontinued operations in 1999. Wow, only one Nobel Prize winner has acknowledged contributing sperm to it. Wow. Mr. Lanier, the virtual reality creator and author, said he had the impression that Mr. Epstein was using the dinner parties, where some guests were attractive women with impressive academic credentials, to screen candidates to bear Mr. Epstein's children. Mr. Epstein did not hide his interest in tinkering with genes and in perpetuating his own DNA. One adherent of transhumanism said that he and Mr. Epstein discussed the financier's interest in cryonics, an unproven science in which people's bodies are frozen to be brought back to life in the future. Not going to happen. Not going to happen. Never going to happen. Okay, I think it might happen one more time in the end times with the Antichrist, but that's a whole nother video. Mr. Epstein told this person that he wanted his head and penis to be frozen. Southern Trust Company, Mr. Epstein's Virgin Island Incorporated business, disclosed in a local filing that he was engaged in DNA analysis. Calls to Southern Trust, which sponsored a science and math fair for school children in the Virgin Islands in 2014, were not returned. In 2011, a charity established by Mr. Epstein gave $20,000 to the Worldwide Transhumanist Association, which now operates under the name Humanity Plus. The group's website says that its goal is to deeply influence a new generation of thinkers who dare to envision humanity's next step. Mr. Epstein's foundation, which is now defunct. What the world? When that happened? Mr. Epstein's foundation, which is now defunct, which means no longer existing or functioning. Defunct. Why couldn't they just say that? Mr. Epstein's foundation, which is now defunct, also gave $100,000 to pay the salary of Ben Goetzel, vice chairman of Humanity Plus, according to his resume. Goetzel. I have no desire to talk about Epstein right now, he said in an email to the New York Times. The stuff I'm reading about him in the papers is pretty disturbing and goes way beyond what I thought his misdoings and kinks were. Yike, he says. A professor emeritus of law at Harvard recalled that at a lunch Mr. Epstein hosted in Cambridge, Massachusetts, he steered the conversation towards the question of how humans could be improved genetically. The professor said he was appalled given the Nazis' use of eugenics to justify their genocidal efforts to purify the Aryan race. Yet, the lunches persisted. Everyone speculated about whether these scientists were more interested in his views or more interested in his money, said the professor, who was one of Mr. Epstein's defense lawyers in 2008. Luminaries at Mr. Epstein's St. Thomas conference in 2006 included Mr. Hawking and the Caltech theoretical physics Kip S. Thorne. One participant at that conference, which was on the subject of gravity, recalled that Mr. Epstein wanted to talk about perfecting the human genome. Mr. Epstein said he was fascinated with how certain traits were passed on and how that could result in superhumans. Mr. Epstein appears to have gained entree into the scientific community through Jon Brockman, a literary agent whose best-selling science writers include Richard Dawkins, Daniel Goldman, and Jared Diamond. Mr. Brockman did not respond to requests for comments. For 2 decades, Mr. Brockman resided over a series of salons that matched his scientific authors with potential benefactors. The so-called billionaires' dinners apparently became a model for the gatherings at Mr. Epstein's East 71st Street townhouse, which included some of the same guests. In 2004, Mr. Brockman hosted a dinner at the Indian Summer restaurant in Monterey, California, where Mr. Epstein was introduced to scientists, including Seth Lord, the MIT physicist. Mr. Lord said that he found Mr. Epstein to be charming and to have interesting ideas, although they turned out to be quite vague. Also at the Indian Summer dinner, according to an account on the website of Mr. Brockman's Edge Foundation, where the Google founders Sergey Brin and Larry Page and Jeff Bezos, who was accompanied by his mother, also at the Indian Summit dinner, according to an account on the website of Mr. Brockman's Edge Foundation, were the Google founders. Oh, wow, Mr. Feinstein. All the good-looking women were sitting with the physics table, said Daniel Dubno, who was a CBS producer at the time and attended the dinner, and was quoted as saying, Mr. Dubno told the Times that he did not recall the dinner or having said those words. All the good-looking women were sitting with the physics table. Daniel Dubno, who was a CBS producer at the time and attended the dinner, was quoted as saying, so Mr. Dubno don't remember attending the dinner, and he also don't even remember saying all the good-looking women were sitting with his physics. These people are trying to distance themselves from him now. Can't pretty much blame them. He's a rapist, and he's accused of having a sex trade, or being part of a sex trade of young girls as young as 14 years old. Mr. Jeffrey Epstein, or Epstein. Mr. Brockman was Mr. Jailman's agent, and Mr. Jailman, in the acknowledgments section of his 1995 book, The Cork and the Jaguar, thanked Mr. Epstein for his financial support. However impressive his roster of science contacts, Mr. Epstein could not resist embellishing it. He claimed on one of his websites to have had the privilege of sponsoring many prominent scientists, including Mr. Pinker, Mr. Thorne, and the MIT mathematician and geneticist Eric S. Lander. Mr. Pinker said he had never taken any financial or other support from Mr. Epstein. Needless to say, I find Epstein's behavior reprehensible, he said. Mr. Thorne, who recently won a Nobel Prize, said he attended Mr. Epstein's 2006 conference, believing it to be co-sponsored by a reputable research center. Other than that, he says, I have had no contact with, relationship with, affiliation with, or funding from Epstein. I unequivocally condemn his abhorrent actions involving minors. Lee McGuire, a spokesman for Mr. Lander, said he has had no relationship with Mr. Epstein. Mr. Epstein appears to have made up lots of things, said Mr. McGuire, and this seems to be among them. And this article is according to MSN News. Y'all, please leave a like button, subscribe, leave a comment, hit that bell so you'll know when I have other videos coming up. And for my Spreaker listeners, please follow me on Spreaker. You can also leave a comment there. Let me know how you guys feel about Mr. Jeffrey Epstein and his hopes to seed human race with his DNA. It's your girl, BeeSparrow, and I am Out.